I think we should get going this evening. It's a real pleasure to introduce the third of our lecturers this week, Jesse Reiser, who's a New York-based architect who lives, works, and teaches in New York City. Presently at Columbia University. Jesse trained in the United States at the Cooper Union prior to going on the Cranbrook Academy of Art a few years. I think it is wide open. Yeah? And while at the Cooper Union, met and studied with Aldo Rossi, who he went on to work for before establishing his own practice with his partner Nanako Umemoto in New York. Jesse presently teaches at Columbia University, having also taught at the Berlage Institute, Ohio State University, in Kyoto, where he taught a seminar, and also before that Yale University. Now, the work of Reiser and Umemoto has been widely published and exhibited in the United States, Japan, and Europe. Exhibitions have included one dedicated to solely their work called Solid State Architecture at the Berlage Institute last year. Prior to that at the Cooper Union. 2 years ago, Jesse and Nanako included a piece in an exhibition here that David and Jane organized. And many other places in the United States and Europe. Recent awards by the firm include a Progressive Architecture Award this past year for a project they've recently completed. He's received awards from the Graham Foundation, the National Endowment of the Arts, a Prix de Rome. He's a former fellow of the American Academy in Rome. And in addition to a number of articles and critical assessments, they're working on, I think, presently 2 books. One of which includes an AD monograph on their work that will be coming out shortly. That will include an introduction by Danny Libeskind and another essay by Andrew Benjamin. Andrew's also written on their work in the past and other articles. And I think particularly as the work has developed, they've developed a kind of interest in what Jesse calls a space frame as a kind of diagram. His interest in that's part of his background in materials, especially in the question of construction in architecture. He's found a way to bridge that with certain formal and spatial preoccupations I think a lot of us are aware of through a really unique kind of diagram, the idea of the space frame and the way in which this sort of superlight structure acknowledges a certain kind of capacity for construction and materials, but also has in itself kind of spatial implications. It kind of is a diagram on its own, bridges across what a lot of people have trouble connecting, which is the materials and space itself. Please join me in welcoming Jesse Reiser.
Thank you, Brett. Really tremendous pleasure to be here this evening. The AA has always sort of stood because of my teachers and I guess basically my whole educational background. The AA has been intimately associated with the institutions that I've been involved with, but I've really never spent any time here before now. So it's really a pleasure to see all of you and really seeing the work over the past 3 days and the kinds of really parallel interests and issues that have been brought up I want to address this evening. And so I guess first I'd like to say that I'll be presenting, after I read this paper, which I hope you'll bear with me, its length, I'll be presenting 5 projects. First, the water garden that Brett spoke about, which we did in collaboration with Jeffrey Kipnis, Ohio. Our proposal for the Yokohama Port Terminal, which I'm sure you're all aware of. Our proposal for Bucharest 2000, which was an urban planning competition 2 years ago. Actually, Raul presented his proposal on Monday for that. And a small selection of built projects, which have some resonance in a way, of course, with our larger, more ambitious but unbuilt competition projects. And then finally, our proposal for Kansai Library. First, though, I want to read this paper in parallel with some slides. And I guess I should say that I do this with some trepidation, maybe almost the opposite of what Bob brought up, and that is to say I'm not obviously a trained historian or theorist, so the conclusions and the projections I'm going to make tonight really derive more from an involvement with design. So in that sense, the discussions won't have a systematic basis, at least as an historical development, but more in a way laterally and more kind of developing out of the design projects that we've been in. So in a way it's about kind of filling up the chart, in a sense, by way of projects rather than seeing things from the outside, in a sense, or from an historical perspective. In any case, I guess I should get into it. This paper was initially kind of prompted because I was invited to Cornell to participate in a lecture series which was entitled Media Space. And I really, for the life of me, couldn't figure out why I was included in that list, simply because our work has never really, at least in the more obvious ways, gotten involved in the so-called issues of virtual reality or video or all of those kinds of interests that have recently entered into architectural discourse. So I began to think of how I might begin to frame a discussion which would actually include the work, and I began to realize that media is, in a way, very deeply part of what we do, except that we don't really approach it, I suppose, from the side of representation or the side of the more obvious kinds of forms of media. So I should just begin. We have the lights and the recent emergence of media-based architecture and the categorical accommodations that have ensued between building-based practices on the one hand and those which locate architecture in the virtual realm on the other have paradoxically overlooked a realm of endeavor which actively incorporates one in the other. The arguments that have recently been attached to media and its relation to architecture have generally focused on information technologies associated with electronic or mass media formations. Hence, the proliferation of projects by architects that attempt to recover for architectural space the fugitive and placeless condition inherent in electronic technologies. These projects have generally assumed two forms. The first example is the work of Laura Kurgan, who was an architect living in New York, teaching, I believe, at Yale University, and she dealt with how global positioning systems would map out in space. But her work really doesn't attempt or is really not interested in any final kind of material manifestation, but it's more about a kind of mapping, a spatial mapping of points in space without any further form of definition. So the first approach, which is the more radical of the two, would shift architecture entirely out of the material realm and understand it as a set of orders or protocols proper and sufficient to themselves. This assumption follows from the position that the advent and implementation of these new technologies signals the inevitable fulfillment of an historical process, charting the liberation and amplification of power structures once bound up within architectural constructs. This would seem to render the forms of order associated with material building obsolete, as the institutions they once housed now find their most effective expression in the virtual. Indeed, the semiotic dimension of architecture, which is always in an uneasy relation to matter, now finds its natural medium. Both built architecture and its capacity to enact constraining frameworks, panopticism, disciplinary regimes, all the work that Foucault has written about, has been largely superseded by virtualized and less tractable forms of control. Architecture, in light of this polemic, would be understood as a dead husk that has given up its instrumental ghost, the ghost being set free to proliferate without the material constraints inherent in older architectural formations. And curiously, this approach both reduces architecture to that of a control system, while at the same time positing the advent of immaterial architecture as a newfound freedom. And the second, what I call a kind of conciliatory approach, and the example I give is Herzog and de Meuron's library proposal for Jésus, recognizes the continued relevance of building, but conceptually and literally articulates media from building. In this kind of attenuated form of modernism, the place of media assumes a kind of sublimated or decorative position within the enframing operation of the building. Electronic media projected on screens or walls updates the fugitive effects of transparency and reflectivity found in the earlier modernisms. What remains constant, however, is the classical hierarchy governing the relationship between structure and ornament, with the literal structure forming a limiting and regulating framework within which the media ornament might be domesticated. Ultimately, these models derive from a history that would first locate the effective means of power in architecture as coextensive with building up to the end of the classical period, and then trace the progressive liberation of those power structures, ultimately in media, from their material constraints. Thus, from the viewpoint of architecture as power structure, its material form appears to become increasingly ineffective. Hence, a loss of architecture as power as a material manifestation and the consequent migration of architecture to the electronic realm. While this tendency may seem historically visible logic, it is not necessarily the only logic by which architects might continue to produce effective structures. In fact, the ever-widening gap between material constructs and the power they might exert is due now more to architectural practices, which perpetuate this division, than any deeper or inevitable movement within the economy of architecture itself. Further, for an architect who sees a continued relevance in material constructs, this mode of operations proves counterproductive. We might welcome architecture's newly acquired residual status as an opportunity rather than a loss. A vital distinction was made by French philosopher Gilles Deleuze in relation to the modalities and uses of power in his comparison between Foucault's term pouvoir and Nietzsche's puissance. Both are usually translated as power, but Nietzsche's puissance is the power to act, which is potential, while pouvoir is the codified image of such active power in the reactive powers that be, which define and constrain what is possible. Puissance opens up possibilities and capacities, while the pouvoir closes them off, regimenting passive subjects by defining their roles or formal capacities. I would hazard to suggest that the degree to which the aforementioned models of architectural practice prioritize representational space, whether by process or critique, passively abets these kinds of totalizing forces outlined by Foucault. Any work of architecture may be discussed in terms of what it is or what it signifies. The crucial question here, especially in relation to design practice, is the effect that such conceptions have on the formation of, and ultimately on the performance of the architecture itself. Signification as byproduct or effect is both as inevitable as it is changeable. Indeed, the kind of determinations it brings to a work, both in terms of process and practice, stand in opposition to an architecture of becoming. Puissance suggests a fundamental shift away from power as a representational form to that of an active principle. And in respect to architecture, this would mean taking the actual flow in material conditions as the privileged history. I would like to outline a third approach which builds on the idea of puissance, and in doing so, it would be important to shift the sense and way it is understood in an architectural context. This will entail a renewed emphasis on the efficacy of matter itself. The assertion arises from the realization that matter is not inert, but rather it is stuff charged with potential. This suggests a rather untimely mixing of traditional architectural practices with the emerging notions of complexity, in which the conception of media has nothing whatever to do with signs or images, but rather involves the activity of mediation. This is to say that material logics have the capacity for involvement with, across, and through one another. Consequently, instead of viewing the building in terms of representation or symbolization, what is at stake is its own internal economy, and thus its activity as a building. Change thus becomes an active expression of the material organization of the building. In claiming that the first two models of media in architecture engage too narrow a bandwidth, we're not calling for a repudiation of those practices, nor positioning ourselves in some dialectical relationship to them, but rather that they fail to engage notions of media that are inherent in architecture as a material process and practice. As Deleuze writes in an article curiously enough entitled Mediators, philosophy, art, and science come into relations of mutual resonance and exchange, but always for internal reasons. The way in which they impinge on one another depends on their own evolution. A discipline that set out to follow a creative movement coming from the outside would itself relinquish any creative role. You'll get nowhere by latching onto some parallel movement. You have to make a move yourself. If nobody makes a move, nobody gets anywhere. Nor is it an interplay and exchange. It all turns on giving and taking. Thus, if the semiotic can only be a kind of superimposition on the generative side of practice, it might properly be located then on the side of criticism or interpretation, and thus can be said to have achieved, if it hasn't always, the status of a kind of meta-language. While mass media directs flows of disembodied information, we'll move laterally along the electromagnetic spectrum and emphasize a materially engaged notion of media, and following from that, media's informative capacities in relation to built architectural space. I would like to characterize this new form of practice as operating in the so-called solid state. I choose the term because the notion of solid state carries with it the idea that the material formations are inextricably linked to the computational logics inherent in materiality itself, what Sanford Quinter calls wet computation. Therefore, in contrast to the two models outlined earlier, the heavy and recalcitrant and apparently inert condition of building need not be divorced from virtualities. The term solid state becomes interesting here not because it refers strictly to solid state physics per se, but because analogous behaviors are possible in other forms of order, namely architecture. This model first assumes that we are dealing with an essentially materialist conception of the real. However, it is not about the isolated and static billiard ball materiality of the Newtonian model, but rather real materiality in real time, a materiality inextricably bound up and traversed by forces. As noted structural engineer Cecil Baumann of Ove Arup has observed, the classical determinism of Newton pictured force as an arrow straight and true. It bridged the void in unwavering linearity, the fixed link of a rigid chain of logic. Now we can see force differently, as the minimum path through a field of potential. Depending on local conditions, the path may vary, but the trajectory is based on moments of mutual cooperation, a simultaneous juxtaposition that charts a minimum path. Implicit in this statement is the understanding that the structures and components which comprise buildings are capable of lateral communication through one another, provoking developments which, while inherent within the definition of the structure itself, remain only unfulfilled potentials without the provocation of some outside force, that is, of an adjacent structure. The demand here is to invigorate the entire range of possibilities constrained within a given material logic. Further, these material logics and potentials are rooted in very real structures and matter comprising building elements. The first solid-state transistor illustrates this. Its developers, Brattain and Bardeen, were able to amplify electrical current in a slab of germanium by exploiting the ability of electrons in solids to leave their atomic anchors and instead become a river of electrons with no allegiance to specific atoms. A more apt example might be that of a set of trusses, the geometry of which is configured according to minimal and invariant lines of force ordained by Newtonian physics. It is possible for a truss structure to move beyond merely representing the reduced mechanism of spanning or framing if it factors into itself the various surrounding elements of the building. All of this is done in terms of force. In our proposal for the Yokohama port terminal, the structural system begins as a set of repeating trusses. These are conceived as malleable at their control points, so that as other systems pass around and through them, such as roads, gardens, cladding, etc., they deflect to varying degrees. This kind of accommodation involves generating an intensive fitness between and across elements. A more thorough intermixing then is possible through mere adjacencies. This is due to the development of change in the actual material configuration of the components so that there is adherence at the level of organization. Resonance across elements does not rely entirely upon chance relationships of adjacent programs, but rather works programs into one another through the material of which they are comprised. In Yokohama, this results first in a set of variegated trusses, their differentiation resulting from a complex consistency with the surrounding material. Other components of the port terminal also show signs of influence from neighboring material logics. The access road is driven from its straight line tendency into a progressive arc due to the pressures of surrounding truss profiles. Civic programming on the roofscape contorts to accommodate its structure. The network of pedestrian paths traversing the gardens are denied any degree of regularity in their adaptation to the contours of the roof. It is an oversimplification to describe any constituent component of a building as bounded and isolated within its own strict definition. Only when structures are opened up to the influences of neighboring structures, however different, might the entirety of the potential flow through them. This is not to say, however, that the identity of a discrete component is lost or even lessened through such intermixing. Indeed, differing elements enrich one another, pulling out underexploited potentials and less familiar vagaries which comprise the larger definition of a given structure. This solid-state notion of architecture then engages media in two distinct yet related ways. First, media as a material substance, like a painter's medium, Second, media as a virtual or informing potential. These are not in practice separate notions or procedures, but rather can be said to be folded together within the conception of the diagram. As architects, we're apt to regard diagramming in terms of either the fixed norms of classical geometry and typology, or as reductive descriptions of programmatic or functional relations, like bubble diagramming. If, however, we shift our focus from such static models to dynamical, essentially time-based systems, then an entirely new horizon of potentials emerges. Time, in other words, reappears in the world as something real, as a destabilizing but creative milieu. And that's a quote from Sanford Quinter. A corresponding shift, therefore, is necessary from the fixed, bounded geometry of classicism to a language of waves, fields, and fronts. Incidentally, the fundamental breakthrough in solid-state physics came about in the shift from grids to lattices. Along with this shift comes distinctly unclassical notions of universality. The temporal material fluxes, what Manuel de Landa calls figures of destiny, are singular incarnations of order whose lineaments come into being momentarily. As such, they are not distant or prior to or above the material conditions that spawned them. A disquieting yet eminently useful universal structure emerges. That is, the diagram, which has no essential origin, can be incarnated in multiple scales, materials, and regimes. While such diagrams may be reductive of the phenomenon they are apparently derived from, it is this quality which it allows for their importation into architecture. It follows, then, that such conceptions allow for architecture's participation in a kind of universality, a notion Manuel de Landa refers to as mechanism independence. One and the same mathematical mechanisms can account for a multiplicity of events that would seem otherwise to be wholly unrelated. Therefore, it would be as valid to say that architecture might involve itself in the kindred forms of order, such as the weather or the onset of turbulence in a liquid, not because it takes those phenomena as a referent, but precisely because it reduces or excludes the phenomenal dimension and instead maps only its dynamics as vectors, fields, or fronts. By virtue of the map's reductive treatment of its nominal content, it can be shifted. It then becomes possible for it to engage in an architectural systematicity, which in turn allows for its rematerialization in the stuff of architecture, with all of its attendant phenomena. By its very applicability, the diagram is inherently architectural, and from this point of view was never anything else, neither metaphor nor symbol, but a literal employment of the order itself. The locking on of a diagram does not operate simply in just one way as a system. Its expression depends upon the scale or the place in the hierarchy in which it's deployed. Thus, in the case of architecture, it operates from the fundamental level at the scale of materials themselves to simple assemblies such as structural member, then to larger assemblies built of repetitive units, and so on up to the and beyond the scale of the city. These hierarchies, however, do not follow the linear descents and ascents from the general to the particular or the particular to the general, but rather involve feedback loops and transverse communications across these nested assemblages. These negotiations across hierarchies seem to involve both a bottom-up and top-down approaches, neither in themselves being sufficient or applicable to all situations. Ultimately, it is inevitable that a reciprocity is developed from one to the other. While a bottom-up approach is often a successful way into the development of a project, say at the scale of a building, the variegated conditions which exist in the context and scale of an urban proposal generally demand the opposite. The sheer complexity of contexts in combination with the irreducibility of certain conditions would suggest managing them from an already complex state without even apprehending the fundamental principles. This not only implies that one needn't know the formula for plaster to build a wall, but that for the intended purposes of the designer, certain organizations are only useful at a relatively high level of complexity. Moreover, these systems often contain apparent anomalies which lie fallow, the use of which only become visible later. This last point is especially critical in the formation of a lasting fitness between a building and its context, as it provides organizational flexibility in time. These issues will be further elaborated through a discussion of a recent project for a water garden with Jeff Kipnis, for Jeff Kipnis. Just as the upward thrust of a mountain range breaks up the orderly flow of winds around the Earth's surface, creating local eddies which in turn affect temperature and rainfall, so the variegated peaks and valleys of the water garden exert a spectrum of turbulent effects on the flow space of the garden. And like the relative fixity of a mountain range, whose movements could only be mapped in geologic time, versus the relative rapidity of the weather, the time, materials, and forces involved in the strata of the garden embody a radically different times of formation versus times of effect. Indeed, while the origins of the diagrams that determine the three strata of the garden could not be more disparate, their exchanges are not. The meaning of the relationship among them arises not in their origins, but in the way the diagrams communicate through their material incarnations. While history is not communicated, force is. The magnitude and direction of a force, its vectorial resultants, finds expression not simply in itself, but non-linearly in the adjoining media. These exchanges, while mutual, are also not equal. The dominant media, in this case the fixed geometry of the concrete slab of the garden, exerts proportionally greater influence than the relatively weak forces of the flow space, which is the water space. This is not a simple dominance, however, because lateral efflorescences, mineral and vegetal, engender moving tracks that crisscross the flow space, dissipating the determinations of the slab. In addition, the fine-scale effects of surface tension and meniscus are amplified by the ogive geometry of the grooves. Every change in water level results in a new and changing constellation of puddles and walking surfaces. Such effects are accelerated as the water rises because the geometry of the ogive tends increasingly towards the horizontal with every increase in vertical dimension. One can carry the weather analogy further, that the same mountain range and indeed the same airflow can produce a multitude of local weather effects from fogs to thunderstorms can be accounted for by the fact that the air is not a uniform media, but is widely variable in terms of temperature and humidity, which in turn determines its stability or instability. Interaction with the mountain range triggers the release of potentials latent in the air mass, and thus the same mountain range will trigger fogs in the stable air mass and thunderstorms in the unstable one. The above described capacities of diagrams leave something of their openness in the material they come to inhabit. They carry with them potentials which, beyond inducing differentials at the level of design, produce fields in which unforeseen effects tend to unfold with the exigencies of use. Constructed out of a logic of transition, dynamical diagrams not only shake loose the rigidified structures, both material and institutional, which they inhabit, but then persist in these organizations to provoke ever-changing constellations or conditions of inhabitation. The first case is one of morphology, the second the one of ensuing effects. The first demands a renewed recognition of the interaction of matter and effects. Rem Koolhaas has asserted that where there is architecture, nothing is possible. In the absence of architecture, everything is possible. The accuracy of this statement relies upon the presupposition that architectural efficacy no longer resides in material constructions, or conversely, that empty space offers more possibility than a materialized space of architecture. As mentioned above, it seems that most practices currently involved in the question of media and effect hold this presupposition, which then gives credence to Koolhaas's argument. But it is important to remember that this precondition, while popular, is by no means necessary. If instead modes of production are sought and developed, which posit a thorough and continued investment of the virtual in the material, Koolhaas's assessment and the unspoken foundations its unspoken foundations is called into question. We're working to develop an alternative view to those who would weaken the economies internal to architecture, a model which refigures the stuff of architecture not in terms of static and bounded objects, but rather as material charged with potential, insisting upon architecture's continued capacity for the production of possibility. And these last slides are some of the renderings that were made, sort of 3/4 of the way through the project. I should actually backtrack. Slide on the right indicates the kind of change that we were looking for in plant material, so that with a change in media, that is that the plant submerged would actually begin to develop in a different way than the plant out of the water. And on the left, the water garden, which I guess I should explain, is a 25-foot by 75-foot concrete slab, which is a kind of furrowed like plowed field, is draped over an earth-berm landscape, which is at the back of Jeff Kipnis's house. And the folds in the earth then transmit certain information through this system that's laid above, and so that there's a kind of communication, in a sense, from one system, which is the kind of substrate of the ground, through the concrete slab into the grooves, and finally into the medium of the water. So this is the kind of furrow system, or a portion of it. Then there are these fingering elements which actually ride on the edges of the earth berms, and those are points of mixture between the kind of surrounding context of the grass. So there's actually grass growing in alternating grooves, and then water moving out from the other direction. And then this was a rendering which tries to approximate some form of growth. It's really not terribly successful in that way. And then finally, these images of the garden. First, this is an LOM model, which was a laminated object model, which is made of thousands of layers of paper, which were laser cut and then laminated and finally sprayed with a metal alloy to coat the element. So it was really developed from alias models first, and then made actually into a kind of material construction. And then the slide on the right is actually how we would plan to construct the garden. So the same program could be used to mill blocks of foam in order to produce a mold, and then essentially the water garden would be broken up into a series of tiles, which would then be kind of tiled together into an already existing kind of shallow pool, and the water system would be kind of routed through holes underneath, so that there would be a whole series of different plateaus for water to emerge and then run into the grooves. So this shows the positive and the negative mold, and then its point in the garden. It's in the tile pattern of the garden. Okay, next project should be fairly familiar to you, at least given the site and Alejandro's winning proposal. This is our proposal for the Yokohama port terminal. And as I said before, we were really interested in a way in using, in a sense, utilizing a typology that we already knew, that of the shed building, and in attempting to begin to kind of run differentials through that shed building in order to engender more capacities than would normally in the standard kind of shed be possible. So one of the kind of imperatives of the competition was not only to make a kind of smoothly functioning terminal building, but also to provide an urban amenity, a landscape, which we kind of conceptually saw occurring both on the roof, but also within the depth of the truss system itself. And these were two other concepts that we were very kind of interested in. One was on the left. This is actually a photograph of a section of a rocket. And basically, given the nature of the terminal, we were interested in first looking at the symmetrical and what would essentially be very regular systems, and how when you begin to kind of exert constraints on very regular systems, they then have to, past a certain threshold, have to begin negotiating with one another. So conceivably, if you had infinite space, all of the tubing and elements of that rocket engine would probably form some kind of a grid, or some at least very simple linear system. But because of the constraint of the outside of the rocket, you suddenly have all of this very intensive negotiation. So that was one of the conceptions we began to deal with in terms of how we would begin to kind of negotiate with multiple systems within and in and on the terminal shed. The second was also a kind of, in a way, a very interesting mismatch between an existing building, and in this case it was an attempt to map a new kind of plan for cladistics, which was actually a kind of evolutionary diagram, into the plan of the old Museum of Natural History. And Stephen Jay Gould actually wrote about this, that there was a very strange thing, that the building began to, in a way, to overdetermine how the exhibition space might unfold. So there was a real kind of dilemma in terms of exhibition design between the diagram and then the building it had to kind of go into. So we were very interested in that as well, because in a sense there wasn't an absolute kind of correspondence between the kinds of programming in the terminal, and it meant that we would have to, again, in a sense, negotiate with two essentially very different kinds of condition. And this was an initial kind of wax model that we made. This was, in a way, a project done prior to computers. So it was done, this was kind of an initial volumetric study which dealt with what we already were generating, which was an essentially symmetrical plan of the terminal underneath, and then how that symmetry begins to get split and bifurcated and even trifurcated with the addition of this new, well, not new, but with the addition of the other elements within and above, which is essentially the garden elements and the public elements. So we were looking at first at three-hinged arch structures, and also at sheds in general. And basically, it was one of these kinds of problem situations that we were confronted with a cross-section, which I guess I could kind of roughly show here, where there were certain kind of limits in terms of where decks would have to extend in relation to a ship, which would be adjacent to this structure, which would set one set of limits, and then a very narrow zone where structure could actually come down. So we realized we were already, in a sense, in kind of cantilever territory, and that things would actually have to grow out of the initial span in order to kind of fulfill the more functional elements of the program. So essentially, we took as a basic idea that we were going to be doing a shed, but then the shed had to undergo change in order to really accommodate the systems that it was being asked to do. So one of the books I was looking at, and it was actually an Architectural Association publication, I guess done about 7 years ago, was a really terrific book called Housing the Airship. And in one of the types, you see this very peculiar set of substructures hanging from the main span. We didn't really want to understand what we were doing as being simply applied like this, but it gave us a kind of spark to think about how it would be possible actually to make a system that would, in this case, it was about handling the cross-section of an airship and essentially kind of grabbing two hydrogen-filled airships into the bottom of the shed. But we were interested in kind of taking a system that would be not unlike this and actually merging it with this, so that essentially the three-hinged arch would undergo change itself. So we finally came up with a basic set of intervals. There were 28 three-hinged arches, each of which were, I think 17 meters across, and about 42 meters in span. The whole dimension of the pier being 412 meters. And so there was a kind of very pragmatic issue of the spacing of the spans in relation to the lowest level, which was actually parking, and balancing that with how you would the kind of logical spacing of the three-hinged arches above. So there was a kind of an attempt to look at the systems from the lowest level of the terminal and see how they would then kind of play up right to the top of the terminal itself. So this was the first version. It was actually a laser-cut model generated. In this case, it was actually hand projected and then turned into CAD files and cut out. So it was a kind of model kit that we made. And that was the state of the terminal when it was sent for the competition. So we made claims, in a sense, for the roof garden, but hadn't yet really figured out how to project and design the path system. And that actually came later. Again, this is one of the kind of cross sections. You can see actually the kind of very symmetrical layout of the terminal itself, but then it gets shifted over. And one of the ideas we actually had that kind of motivated the whole project was that the automobile area, the kind of turnaround and bus drop-off, would not occur at the root of the pier, but would actually be brought out to almost to the end of the pier. So the automobile actually then becomes an element that rides, at first on the outside, well, sort of in between the outermost structural element and the innermost one, which actually hangs off this element. And that there would be a kind of use of the terminal that wouldn't be simply about pedestrian use, but would actually very kind of actively incorporate vehicular circulation within the structure itself. And on the left, the lowest parking plan, and then the main plan. Here you can see the access road coming along, and then actually turning into the bus and automobile plaza drop-off, and then the the return road which actually goes inside of the terminal itself. So it kind of moves from the outside, does the drop-off, and then moves to the inside in a glazed tube. And then the whole symmetry of the terminal is actually shifted over in response to the road system. And then this was a solid model that was actually made after the structural model, and it was really the model that we needed to develop the skin. So the outlines of the truss members were then kind of filled in with a putty, and then the model's surface elements we began to work on this solid model and then remove as a shell that we could begin to manipulate. It's an earlier set. So this was the final state of the model, where we began to really look at first the major programmatic elements, which really kind of actively begin to get folded into the roof structure, and the roof structure then responds and incorporates those programmatic elements. The left-hand slide being the underside, the right being the top. But there was still the question of how we would deal with the fine path system. And finally, we began to realize that the only way of really managing it would be to produce a topographical representation of those surfaces, and then begin to analyze them that way. So the path system then really was accommodating first the top surface, and in the right, this is actually a kind of a model which extracts the path system out of the terminal itself. So the red elements being on the surface, the blue being kind of linking systems, and then the yellow being actually in the depth of the trusses. And finally, this is a series of shots where we actually projected the drawing back onto the model, and we actually found a point where it would very kind of precisely lock, and the topographical lines actually fall precisely at the right heights in the model itself. So it's a kind of a reverse projection, which actually sort of was the proof that the analytical side was actually working. Next project, which is really radically different in scale, was our proposal for Bucharest 2000. And it was really somewhat of a quandary for us, because we were confronted with a city that very recently had this kind of totalitarian structure inserted into itself. And the building program, and of course the presidential palace of Ceausescu, was so massive and so overpowering that the suggestion in the brief to deal with a kind of contextualism, a kind of local contextualism, seemed ridiculous to us. But at the same time, we weren't really enamored of this kind of inflated kind of monumental urbanism either. So we began to think of some other way of dealing with a situation like this, where we weren't going to, in a sense, touch anything that was there, but in some way revalue the system that was in place. So we began to think about what was really missing in this whole situation, where you had a kind of scar in the center of Bucharest, a kind of violence done to the medieval city, and certainly a more recent violence done to the people in Romania. So in a way, it would also be a kind of cover-up to remove this structure as well on another level. So again, we were trying to find a way of dealing with this difficulty, and we came up with the idea that there would be, in a sense, a necessity for kind of economic invigoration of the country. And since the project was actually focusing on the center of the city, and this was of importance, that we would actually, in a sense, begin with that spot. And would begin by looking at a possible way of understanding how infrastructure could, in a sense, revalue the condition of the axis. So what we did was to propose a series of systems, one which we call the kind of course system, which is essentially a high-speed automobile loop, which then actually fed off to the major avenues which kind of led out of the city and finally to highways. I remember asking Andrew Benjamin where the main highways in Romania are, and he said, highways? There are no highways. It really means that the kind of economic transformation in a country like this would, in a sense, depend upon the building of major infrastructural systems. And so we began to look at a way of, kind of starting that at the level of the site, and that while it also would kind of serve to begin to, rather in a kind of along American models, we began to look at programs that would be very large, like shopping malls and convention centers, that would actually be inherently attached more to this kind of global infrastructure and less to the context itself. And it would also, at the same time, serve as a kind of counter to a building which is, I think, probably the second largest building in the world. So we would need to, our idea was to produce an infrastructural system that would finally, even though it's occurring at the center of Bucharest, ultimately have no center, because it would inherently not really be attached to centrality. And at the same time, begin to generate buildings from the direction of a kind of global system down to the local, rather than following the kind of contextual suggestion of the brief. So that there was a kind of course system which dealt with this high-speed automobile loop, ways off at interchanges, especially major kind of cloverleaf intersection adjacent to the Ceausescu Palace, and then a series of programs that would essentially branch off of that system and finally get finer, and those blue elements are really a kind of graphic instrument to begin to develop a finer system from the larger, coarser system of the highway. So at once they would be read by us both in certain situations as path and other points as a kind of finer set of building typologies. So this was the initial kind of Ceausescu axis, which was superimposed on the old medieval fabric, and then our proposal, which actually essentially encompasses, in terms of outline, the areas sort of laid waste by Ceausescu and never built. So those areas that are bounded by the finer kinds of structures, the lines there, are essentially open places in the city. And then these are two maps. So we basically, started with this kind of brutal system, and then, as a kind of second-level development, decided that it wasn't enough to put a kind of high-speed system into the axis, that in a sense would be overly brutal, but that rather there would be a next stage where we would actually cover over that high-speed automobile loop with a mounded park. So basically, what it meant was you'd never really be able to kind of go into the axis itself, that there would be a kind of very active, localized landscape that would constantly deflect you kind of locally off the axis. So that became a kind of program for the axis itself, and then there was the kind of initial intuition about extending the green space into the open areas, and then further, really only a kind of suggestion of development. So these are really more or less kind of emblematic of possible ways of handling development, although we produced this kind of large shopping mall, convention complex, there was already an existing, well, Ceausescu had torn down a large stadium and made it into a car park. So we rebuilt the stadium, and it became, well, there were still foundations for it, so we simply decided it should be rebuilt, and it became a kind of nucleus for another large set of sports-related programming, so that there were a whole set of kind of large-scale structures that would then key into this high-speed automobile loop and interchange system. And then these are some views of the project. Here you can see this kind of axial-mounded park. And I think Raul talked about this very curious junction of the river that Ceausescu had turned into a kind of canal, and this point of where it crosses over or under the axis actually is shunted under the axis presently in a series of very massive underground tubes. So at that point, we couldn't really be underground with the high-speed automobile element. It actually goes above the ground and then goes back into the mounded park again. And then, of course, there's also, we retained the finer, the smaller scaled streets so that one would still have kind of normal access to the existing buildings, but that there would also be this kind of massive central element that would be buried and then would finally emerge and make a loop around the palace and then feed off of, well, have these kind of larger developments feeding off of it. On the right, a rendering of the presidential palace and this large complex, and then again, more or less from the center of the axis looking towards the end, away from the presidential palace. Okay, I'm going to kind of radically jump in scale now, and I wanted just to show very quickly a series of projects that we built, which in a curious way kind of invert the kind of theory-practice argument in the sense that at a very small scale, we were beginning to kind of look at structures and of elements that finally were expressed in the more kind of speculative work. So it actually went from kind of small-scale building and development of, almost furniture-scale elements to concepts that we would then apply in competitions in a much more ambitious way. So in this case, it was a landscape design with a fence system that we designed that would be in a way supple and changeable in relation to landscape. And here we were experimenting with cantilevers. This is a bench and swing element that stood atop an earth berm that we designed. So we designed the landscape and these elements in this project. This was also, again, at a very kind of modest scale, a spa that we designed as part of a landscape project. And here, again, in a way very similar to the Yokohama project, we were dealing with a kind of communication across very kind of closely spaced elements. So in a way, they would always exchange information with one another. This is a chaise-longue, which was designed to hold the proportion of a man, the proportion of a woman. There was a kind of shift in scale and a kind of slippage in the way it's developed. It was developed out of gunite, and we designed all of the templates and so forth. And then the actual spa was formed up in a day, actually, by a series of incredible Portuguese concrete crew. And then this was a women's health care clinic. Actually, we have been involved in this program for developing a whole series of these clinics across the United States, and they're all actually attached to, in some way, shopping mall developments. They kind of follow the logic of the malls and find rental space in these places, and that these are kind of upscale women's health facilities. And so we were interested in developing a kind of vocabulary for the center that would incorporate in a way very intensively programmatic elements, along with our interest in these kinds of complex geometries and movement. So this is actually the outer wall of a conference room, and then there's this kind of meander, which normally in these kinds of clinics is a kind of necessity, in the sense that in a waiting room, you never want to look straight down a hallway. So usually it's a fairly banal kind of fin element, and we actually made it in principle, part of the form of the space itself, so it became a kind of a space in itself that actually people have said, and I was quite shocked, that they felt some kind of a feeling of acceleration moving through the space. I mean, one always you kind of project these ideas as an architect in theory, but then someone completely, out of the blue came up to me and said that they experienced it, so I was in complete shock. Again, this was a view from the inside looking out from the examination area, which is essentially very straightforward, kind of linear, pretty banal planning of examination rooms. Just budgetarily, they didn't allow us to continue our developments into the examination area itself. And then this is a view inside of one of the wall intersections inside the conference room. Here there is an area, kind of provision for a children's play area, which is actually kind of tucked in behind one of those meander walls. Another view. And then this was another center. The previous one was in Massachusetts. This was in Washington, D.C. And here there was, we were very interested in even more intensive incorporation of programmatic elements. So there's this kind of reception desk on this side, and then the wall peels in two directions, so it allows a kind of surveillance of children in this little television nook, and also another slot which connects to an office, a records office, which is really a massive element in one of these places, to allow documents to be pushed through. Okay, on to a project which we were involved in very intensively for a short time this summer, which is our proposal for the Student Center at IIT. We felt, in a sense, the underdogs in this competition, where 55 some odd architects were put on a list to present letters of interest to be scrutinized by an illustrious jury and finally be narrowed down to 5. So what we decided was the only way to really distinguish ourselves was to do the proposal, to make some kind of proposal to really show, some kind of intention at the level of something very concrete, instead of making a verbal statement. So in 2 weeks' time, we came up with a kind of quick solution, at least our solution, to the problem of a student center on the Mies campus, which of course is a rather daunting thing, even if you have 6 months to do it. So what we decided, essentially, I don't know if people are aware of the campus, but there's a kind of great split made between the kind of well-known portion of the campus that includes Crown Hall and the Minerals and Metals building and all of the the great elements of the Mies campus. Is split away from the residential side of the campus, which is kind of divided by State Street and also an elevated L train. And the project site, which was developed and I guess suggested by Dirk Lohan, who is, I think, Mies's grandson, suggested that the building site be in one of two places, either across from Crown Hall, that was actually a less recommended site, or on the other side of the intersection of State and, I believe, 33rd, which was the more kind of conventional location of this site. And the student center was really to handle all of the flows across the campus from the residences, which are on this side of the campus, and frat houses, so that there was a whole issue of of centrality, of keeping it as centralized as possible in order to make it, in a sense, democratic, that there would be a kind of collection point pretty much dead center of the campus, and then people would be distributed to either side of the axis. So what we did essentially was to move our proposal off of that site, and actually to avoid, so this was the, what we decided what not to do, and this is what we did. So we basically avoided even trying to address the issue of the Miesian jewels on the fields, and instead align with the infrastructure and to make a kind of bridge out of the student center. So the red arrows simply indicate paths into this bridge, which actually spans both State Street and the L train, and then dumps off on the other side. This is Crown Hall right here. So it straddles the 33rd Street and crosses over State Street. And all the programming then would occur in the bridge. And we also had the opportunity to have recommendations about the structure and the potential of the project from Cecil Baumann. So this is a kind of exploded isometric of the bridge. And essentially the kind of main structural element comes from this complex surface, which then essentially kind of stiffens and structures the perforated floor plates that actually kind of compress around it. So at this point, we really didn't get in so much into a kind of finer development of programmatic elements, but it was more a kind of notional location of where they would be along pathways, and that was as far as we got. And we basically did an alias model of the project, as well as a series of wax study models, which are actually kind of cut off here. But we were both working three-dimensionally in actual materials and in more, you could say, virtually using the computer. And then this was a series of studies of the isostatic kind of stress and strains in the structure. And then some more renderings. This is of the end view of the structure. And all of these elements are actually stairs. These are ramps, and these are stairs. It also, by the way, the intention was to make this bridge connect up with a new stop for the L train, because there actually was never an IIT stop. It was always kind of shifted over to, I believe, the south side of the site. So one of the elements that actually kind of emerges from this, which is really more in the earlier drawing, is an L stop as well. Okay, the last project I'll be showing this evening was our proposal 2 summers ago for the Kansai Library, which is a very peculiar form of library in that much of what it does is not really, half of the use of the library deals with the delivery and the collection of materials. And it isn't really about a traditional library in that one would actually go into, say, the stacks and get materials out, but it would be more a kind of institution that, in the context of the kind of city, and this is one of the new towns between Kyoto and Nara, would serve as a kind of almost a micro-urbanism in itself. And actually, it's very interesting because there was an article by Saskia Sassen that talked about just this kind of institution. I mean, there are arguments, for example, that would say that this kind of library is really, in a sense, no longer necessary. That all of the information gathered in a place like this could be just as easily disseminated along the internet, and there really wouldn't be a necessity for material building at all. But what Saskia Sassen found, which I thought was very interesting, that while that kind of logic may be in place, there's also a kind of corresponding logic that suggests, I don't know if you would even call it public space, but it would be about a kind of a new kind of agglomeration that would occur in countries like Japan, which she calls, well, global cities, or these kinds of new towns, where there would be a very close proximity of institutions, both private and public. And of course in Japan that's always been the case, that they've been really kind of very heavily mixed together. And that there would then be the necessity for a kind of meeting place, a place where programs that would really be unanticipated would occur. And the library, in a way, serves as a kind of pretext for that kind of use. So that was really the kind of driving principle behind what we were thinking about. And what we decided was that we would make a kind of radical separation between the holdings of the library, which, according to the brief, stipulated that no one was really to go into those areas, and that everything, actually we had to design a kind of conveyor system that would move the essentially warehoused materials from one side of the library. This is the warehouse element, and basically we kind of kept it as modern and as kind of regular and as sort of uninflectedly systemic as possible. And then we would conversely look at a very different kind of organization for the public spaces. So this is the location of the library in this Kansai Science City. And one of the things that was actually discussed, too, was that this white area here, which is basically at the back of the site, would allow for expansion. So the idea was that this black element could actually be added to, and it would simply kind of move and expand to that rear site as materials accumulated in the library. So there was a whole elaborate system of categories, too, of sizes of documents and also age of documents that had to be dealt with in that element, and then also kind of transported, as I said before. So we were looking, conversely, at the public spaces, at a way of kind of understanding the project as being not only, that it would be a kind of built landscape. And of course these issues have come up today, and I think this was another addition to, I guess, those projects that attempt to incorporate ideas of landscape into the hard surface of the building itself, and to also, in a sense, make continuous the exterior with the interior. So we were looking at kind of external and internal constraints of order, how either bounding geometries would affect the regularity of certain orders within, and also conversely how what we would call inclusions would begin from within to affect a bounding geometry. And this is the basic configuration of the library. There's a pre-stressed steel roof, which would be seen as a kind of continuous and very rigid shell, from which a series of suspension cables would be suspended. And it was very interesting because in working with the engineer Israel Sinek, who was my structures professor years ago, and who's also responsible for much of the development now on 42nd Street, all the engineering anyway, we came up with a kind of partially flexible system where the roof cables could be located at approximately 10 meters distance from one another, but that they could be moved within a certain range to accommodate or to negotiate around a fairly free development of program in the slabs. This is a lattice truss, which really deals with the issue of lateral motion with earthquake forces to make the whole project a very rigid box, essentially. And then below this, just notionally, our basic kind of configuration of the slabs before a whole series of transformations locally in terms of program and communication among the levels occurs. So the basic idea is a really kind of dumb one of having a kind of ramped system. And that, of course, would begin to suggest a kind of very linear movement up along the ramps and passing through the ramps to the top. So what we did as a kind of further elaboration and really hierarchically would be, in a sense, minor elements, would begin to deal with a whole series of cuts and morphologies that would produce more or less local connections in the structure. So that we began to kind of look at ways of dealing with programming and sequences of programming, not only linearly, but also vertically. And essentially, what came out was that we would be dealing with the more public elements of the library, those actually not so much involved with the acquisition of materials or the reading of materials towards one end of the library in section, and then the more the elements that deal with the main reading room and then Asian document and so forth towards the other side. And in between, in kind of mezzanine levels, which actually blister off of one of the intermediate slabs, there is a kind of educational and theater elements. So this is, of the stack building that we call it. So it's very kind of regular trust series. And the one concession we made to the kind of brutality of the place, and what they were suggesting was a storage system that would be monitored at stations, would be not to make it into a series of horizontal slabs, but rather to make it a kind of catwalk structure, and that the roof would have kind of filtered skylight, so that there would still be a form of kind of regulated natural light going down into the spaces, and it wouldn't be an entirely kind of hermetic, sealed box with suffering workers inside. In any case, this is the grade level, which is parking, and then there are two routes. One goes down to lower parking, and the other involves connection to an element that crosses between the stack building and the more public building, and this is a kind of processing wing. So the documents or books would either travel from storage out to trucks, or conversely be dropped off and go through a series of rooms and then finally into a conveyor system that kind of wraps the outside of that element, and then it's distributed vertically into the building itself. So that conveyor either goes in or out, as do trucks and pickup and so forth. Next level, and here you can really see how we began to kind of deal with the surface of the slabs themselves. So we dealt with a whole series of morphologies of ramps, which actually were very interesting because we were dealing with extreme heights at certain moments in the plan. And the ramps turned out to be too steep for direct negotiation. So then it required a kind of secondary order, a new way of negotiating such steep slopes. So what we did was, in a way, looked at patterns of development that you would see like switchback roads on mountains and so forth, which attempt to then negotiate steeper slopes using a geometry that would then align itself in a less direct manner on the slope. So we began to kind of use that as an economy to, in a way, regulate the flows through the space, that you could manipulate the angles of these minor elements and either kind of slow down or speed up movement locally in the project. This is a geodetic store, which was another kind of part of the public element. One actually is dropped off here, and then you move up these sort of wrinkled ramps in the slab, and then into the ramps finally that go up into the reading room. So these are actually elements that actually extend from above, from the stacks above, down the ramps. And then this is the main reading room. There were some stacks, although they're mainly for kind of reference stacks. And here you can see the kinds of transformations we had to make to the slab in order to have ramped elements kind of drop under and below. And here the slab is scissored in order to produce a series of plateaus for a smaller library, which is the Asian Studies Library. And this is the kind of outline of auditorium space. These holes are actually where the piers of the roof pass through. And here you can see a whole series of connections, mainly ramps to the various levels in the stack building. Side elevation and sectional elevation. So you can see here the cross-section of the pre-stressed steel roof and then the piers that come down. Two sets of piers are actually affixed to the ground. The other two are on Teflon pads because apparently the roof would have considerable expansion, something like 6 or 7 inches in sunlight, so that there would be a kind of problem if all of the piers were fixed. This was a very interesting fact that the engineer told us about. And then here, extracted is this geodetic store, which actually penetrates through all of the layers of the library and then feeds off at various levels. And the geodetic interest actually came from looking at, there was a previous project for Cardiff Opera House that used it in a notional way, but we at that point didn't have the computers to really construct the system, but could only approximate it using string models. And so we became very interested in the system because in a way, well, not in a way, it actually shares its origins with Buckminster Fuller's domes, except what we were looking at was actually its employment by a well-known British engineer, Barnes Wallis, who employed exactly the same system on the Wellington bomber. And it was very interesting because in the case of the Wellington, there was, in a sense, an already existing form of the aircraft, and then Wallis had to basically deploy the system and see how the system would read the existing form. And so, in one sense, it was a very kind of pragmatic approach to the use and deployment of the system. And it also began to reveal differentials in the system that the kind of idealism of Fuller, who insisted on the absolute regularity and repetition of the elements, such that you could hardly even put a door in one of the domes, would never have gotten to. So while there was a kind of pragmatic issue to the deployment of the system in the case of Wallis, we began to look for it as a way of establishing a set of principles. So, for example, the kind of boundary, this is a chunk of the wing of the Wellington, and the boundary of the wing and the way it tapers then necessitates, for example, a kind of change in the reticulation of the system. In the center of the chord, it's almost a grid, but by the time it reaches the end of the wingtip, it becomes this incredibly compressed series of lozenges. So that's one capacity, it's a kind of an external constraint. Another, which I guess there are some indications here, is where the reticulation is broken because it doesn't exactly follow the outline of the form of the wing, and so then there's another response in the system where localized struts emerge from that point to kind of take up where the grid is in a way chopped off. Another would be a kind of inclusion where kind of further inboard there's an engine nacelle which basically carries a chunk of metal that has absolutely nothing to do with geodetics. But nevertheless, the geodetics then have to negotiate around that inclusion so that there's a kind of negotiation from one system to the other. And then there's also a kind of very productive byproduct in that you get a kind of telegraphing of effects through the system, so that this massive chunk of metal of the engine is then expressing its effects back into the system, and it becomes an opportunity, if one looks at it in the abstract, as a way of including, say, programming into a structural system. That it isn't about this is program, this is structure, or this is structure and this is not, but that there's a way of seeing how there's actually a very active interchange between systems. So I hope you'll forgive this little digression, but I think it's very important in terms of the way we've been kind of thinking through projects, both in principle and then specifically here. Again, the elevation of the library, and basically you see the kind of major ramped elements and then how they suspend from the roof, which became increasingly deep given the kinds of loads that were imparted by the slabs. We initially thought that we could structure the whole project kind of locally with an accumulation of local deformations of the slab. And actually that was brought up today in one of the reviews. The engineer gave us the unfortunate news that this was not possible, but that it would work very well. Those kinds of changes that we were doing with ramps would work very well for lateral forces, that they would very much stiffen the building that way, but that they wouldn't be deep enough or stiff enough to be able to kind of work from local to local to local, and there had to be, in a way, a larger scale structure that would be stiff enough to carry the building in total. So I should say at that level, too, that it wasn't about, I mean, retrospectively, there would be a kind of apparent linearity in the process. But in fact, in working out a building project, this development actually came fairly late in the game when we had enough to show the engineer. And then it necessitated a really radical reevaluation of the project. But that didn't mean that it would then simply kind of muddle the project or overly complicated the project. It just clarified it. So I would just add that as well, that in a kind of, in a practical sense, and also could kind of extend it in theory, that it isn't really necessary to understand this kind of and way of designing as being conceptual, in the sense of having the idea completely crystallized from the outset and then simply fulfilling it. But it's really very much in the way we work tied to process, although process isn't used to justify the product, but it's simply a way of kind of working out the project. And obviously, I think, at least to our minds, what finally results is the thing that has to be assessed, and not really propping up the project by way of process. Anyway, I think that's it. Sorry? Sure.
Could we do some questions? Would people like some questions? Can we start? Yeah.
Well, I think that probably the most clear example of the use of diagrams in the work that I showed, and perhaps I didn't show clearly how those projects, many of them kind of proceeded along the lines of diagrams, would be the water garden. And that would be, in using diagrams that would be both inherent in the geometry and the kind of the use first of a very kind of regular geometrical system to produce, say, the furrows in the garden. And then actually the importation of other models to produce the deformations and change in that regular system. So in answer to your question, actually all of the projects have used diagrams, but I would say that the one that probably most clearly exemplifies that kind of process would be the water garden. Yes?
In most of your projects, you have been talking about the influences of, for example, natural forces that you would use as a basis for your project.
Yes.
To me, it seems like you always impose your building on a site. You never take the site as one, never manipulate the site itself or use the conditions of a certain site. It always seems like your buildings are plugged on, like posed on the site. Is that right, or do you really
Well,
love the conditions?
It depends. In the case of Yokohama, it was the site conditions that were most sort of important there were mainly the kind of form of the pier itself, and then the infrastructure that fed the pier. And then it was, beyond that, it was a highly kind of isolated element, and it would be responding more to the influence of the ships and the necessity for connecting to ships. Not really, actually. And it may have been hard to see, but the slab, the actual surface actually emerges out of the ground and then enters into enclosure. So it isn't about something that's actually simply dropped, but there's actually there's a continuous surface that develops off the ground and then enters into the volume, and then it's sort of, yes, I guess the roof structure probably looks as if it's dropped on, but it's actually catching something that's emerging up from the surface the other way. So, yeah, it may have been hard to read, but that was the kind of interest, actually, was a kind of, both a kind of distinctness on one hand in the structure, as it turned out, and then a kind of continuity in the guts of the thing. Yes.
The role of structure seems to be gathering momentum in your work. And, I was wondering if you were any closer to defining the relation between structure and program.
I think, as I said before, there was, this issue of how structure wouldn't simply be a frame for program, a kind of regular frame for it, but that there would be the possibility of a very direct kind of exchange between structure and program. And so, certainly with, the interest in the geodetics, and also, in other ways, in other parts of like the Yokohama project, there's a kind of, it wouldn't be a matter of sort of expressing program in the abstract and then having it sort of be caught by structure. In a way, you have to have a material definition or some limit for program that could be read by structure. So it couldn't be about a completely invisible diagram for program then coming into relation with structure, but you'd actually have to move it into something that really is a material definition for it. But the intention is to really, try to incorporate one in the other and see some kind of exchange between the two.
I think actually it's a very clever move in the way you're going to make, let's say, Kippen's notion of deformation more tangible and immediately meaningful and operational actually in a lot of projects, because he's depending obviously also on a kind of ideal figure. But this might be kind of, some ideal grid invention or formal figure which then is kind of overdetermined and registers various programmatic deviations of that and so on. I think with the structural paradigm, you have already something which has its own kind of internal logic and is maybe immediately understood as initially repetitive.
Right.
And it seems to me the last project, particularly, I commend you for really, really beautiful and charged project, I think, because there's a kind of richness of structural initial principles and notions, even also on a metaphorical level. I love this notion of the telegraphing through of an inclusion. I get the sense that it could work, or like the way that the cables would mostly initially register, where cables kind of suddenly open up a clearing or become more dense, and you sense there's something going on and there's repercussion too.
Yeah.
So then I understand that notion. I think it's clever and helps to make this notion of deformation more tangible in these two projects, that's the Yokohama and the Cancer Library. I like that a lot.
I also want to maybe touch on the last project and
Yes.
a little bit related to the question about landscape, because I thought what was interesting about the last project was precisely this moment when there is constantly this negotiation that is going on between the structuring of the actual frame and the structuring of the project together, and one
Yes.
begins to see other forms of relationship with the landscape. And some things were very interesting, reminiscent of the work of George Nelson in some way with this suspended house, and some other projects where, for example, the relationship to landscape could be the way in which something just simply enframes a condition, or we talked about the idea of the future progression,
Yes.
where this becomes itself a kind of furrow, like the gardening project that could in some way have a certain different kind of relationship to the landscape. So I think in a way it might be interesting for us to think about alternative forms of relationship to site than always the fact that the building becomes site or the site becomes the building, but actually there might be somehow more tensional
Yes.
ways of engagement, which I think that last project was really dealing with in a very interesting and beautiful manner. Maybe as a question, I would be interested to find out how you would, since Robert Somel tried to situate his own work in the context of the genealogy of the projects, how you would now situate yourself in the context of the genealogy that he developed, because it seemed to me that whereas Bob was touching on the question of the 9-square grid, and then somehow went to, for example, the solid that is carved, though I think that was something that we didn't kind of follow. You're now suggesting something that has both the structure and a kind of structuration, which is different, for example, than the idea of carving. And I would be interested how you would situate yourself in the context of last night's presentation.
Very hard. I mean, I was telling Bob that, to me, I mean, in a way, those kinds of distinctions that are made by the kind of graphing that Rosalind Krauss does would, in a way, be a starting point, but they really wouldn't be adequate as, I think, I mean, maybe Bob can disagree or enlighten me, but in a way that they would serve as a kind of endpoint for a whole other series of descriptions diagrammatically that couldn't be simply about making greater and greater sort of dialectical splits or subcategories. And so I don't know what the answer really is. I mean, maybe I'm not answering you properly, but it seems that it's almost that Bob has sort of pushed that form of diagramming to its ultimate conclusion. I don't know if there's any other series of subcategories within that form of diagram that you could do that would be more enlightening.
I think Jesse's just buried me in a way.
Did I bury you? I don't know. I mean, it's
It's like giving
no, it
somebody
was a
cold
genuine
mail.
question. Was that?
Well, they do share, but in an interesting way, they do share a kind of reliance on the 9-square and what you were calling tonight a kind of lattice structure. Isn't that just a kind of formal?
Yeah.
In one way, it's exhausted through this kind of the recursive, like the nested, the Minge sponge especially, it becomes a sort of recursive operation to the point that it almost disappears. In yours, it seems to disappear more through the way in which these forces transform what start as a kind of uniform grid
Right.
structure.
Well, nothing would be seen as a kind of rigid framework,
Yeah.
that they would all be somehow susceptible to change. And of course, I mean, it's very debatable when one talks about force, and I fully admit this. I mean, we talk about site forces. What is a site force? And certain people will develop site forces in the abstract as a kind of notional way of kind of getting a project started, like the movement of automobiles would somehow have a reflection on the morphology of a building. But To me, I think it would never be, I mean, to me it somehow smacks too much of a kind of literary construction, and it would be rather about how you would actually have to kind of use force to develop something up to respond to the car, but it would never really be, the car wouldn't be an origin for, or a rationale simply because it's a moving, you know, cipher.
In some of the projects tonight, you were talking about them in terms of forces actively, but you're also using the word flow at times. And I think, I mean, it made me think of structures, or no, a certain category of objects in the world, like a truss, that in which the kind of structural forces are reduced to
Right.
a kind of flow, and the artifact is like the diagram. There's a kind of overcoming of the two.
Mm-hmm.
That in terms, I mean, the question it raised about the force for me was to keep it from being just an analogy in some of the projects.
Right.
Do they need to be empirical or statistical, calculable in the sense that something like gravitational forces are to operate that way in these objects here? Because there is a kind of denial, like
Yeah.
you're saying, of wanting
Well-
to reduce them to a sort of empirical.
Right. I mean, one would have to admit that the forces, you know, as a Newtonian force diagram, would still be there, but it wouldn't. It would simply not be a question of reducing the kind of the project to that, and that one would actually kind of strive to exceed that in some way. But it would still be there, and it kind of, you know, if one wanted to reduce it or kind of locate it.
Let's do one more, Brian.
You seem to begin by raising a sort of anxiety about the persistence or the ability of architecture to persist in a highly mediated world, as if it was a continuation, a kind of extension of that anxiety, which is always illustrated by the little story from Victor Hugo, you know, this will kill that. The books may kill architecture, and if books have inter-architecture, then computers and radio waves have really got you. And then somehow the sort of overarching metaphor of landscape seems to come in, and I'm wondering how that has happened. Is it that some kind of naturalistic metaphor seems to be the best way of actually mediating a relation between media and the human body, in terms of still trying to work with the traditional, and necessarily traditional, sort of incumbencies of architecture as a physical object and facilities that only a physical object,
Yes.
as opposed to immaterial media can provide.
Well, I guess I would probably start by saying that there would be a kind of, because of the kind of general interest now in biological models, there might be a reading which would attempt to kind of look at the use of those models as a kind of metaphorical issue. But I think the thing that's most important to me would be that the kind of split, say, that one would make between what is artificial and what is man-made wouldn't really hold anymore, and that and this would be inherent in looking at diagrams. And so I guess a lot of the models are drawn from biology or from the natural sciences, or even from I guess from physics too. I mean, when we're looking at dynamical systems and making an assumption that there really wouldn't be a kind of radical split between those systems and artifice, that one could actually be brought into the other. So it wouldn't be seen in some kind of conflict. I don't know if that's an answer to the question, but I think that is probably why one of the manifestations would be landscape or landscape-like formations. equally, we would be dealing, if you're dealing with a kind of gradient mapping, and this is purely almost as a kind of a graphical notion, it would be possible to look at gradient mapping in weather as well as looking at gradients in Earth. So that a lot of times I think these diagrams would have to be understood as being, in a way, incarnatable in many different ways, whether they're understood as a kind of a highly developed surface or whether they're seen as, in a way, a less materialized, less defined as a kind of surface, but more as a kind of a space. But so maybe what you're picking up on, and of course I did mention it, would be the use of notions of gradient mapping, which then play out in things like surfaces or in structure and so forth.
I think my sort of query is about the general tendency to turn towards naturalistic paradigms. I thought perhaps the place where perhaps this weakness emerged was in the Bucharest project, because it seems to me that the question of the meaning of that axis and what might be an alternative use of it or deviation from it or modification of it needs to be answered really by other references which are really drawing from the social reality and the social relations of the vicinity of that axis.
Well, I guess one could, if I could paraphrase Bob last night, I think these diagrams could be understood as immediately kind of social and political even before they become material. So I wouldn't say that the response that we made specifically in that project would be indifferent to those issues. In fact, I mean, it was very intentionally otherwise. I suppose you could disagree with it, but it was certainly not the intention to address, this problem, I don't know, in a way that would be indifferent to the social realm, but that this would be the way of dealing with it. I mean, we were dealing not only with how it looked, but also how it works, so that there would be, and if I could, say probably the weakness in the project would be at the level of the suggestion that it may have looked overly defined in terms of the buildings that were there. But the main interest was really how, at first at least, the systems would be deployed, and then how, after that, there would be a kind of amelioration of the system through the use of this kind of landscaped element in the axis. But, yeah. Yes?
There's no specific question to your presentation, maybe, but I'm just wondering where in the States, as a general trend, there's some sort of open-handed assumption towards science, and I'm wondering where this assumption comes from. And in the States, it seems to me that the sciences is like religions in Newtonian time.
Yes.
and I think it's rather dangerous to assume that science is a model, the model, that we can actually open-handedly accept it. And so, I mean, that's, I think, corresponds to his question that, like in urban planning, the context, I think we should rather focus on other issues like social context and other things, and also the agents that the change is possible. Also, and I mean, just my comment, but how do you think about this as an open-handed assumption for science in the States?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't be able to answer that in general, but I wouldn't also make a kind of split between the kind of operational techniques that we use and a kind of presumption that they're indifferent to the social realm. Because specifically with the Bucharest project, again, it was always, very much on our minds. Actually, it was one of the only projects that I didn't mention this, but probably it would be the only project where we thought that it was still even possible to talk about meaning of that kind because of the state of Bucharest. But you couldn't make claims like that probably in London anymore. But because of this kind of persistence of the totalitarian regime and the kind of the political meanings of the context around that axis, I mean, you might even find an axis like that in Paris, but it would no longer have that resonance. Because of this very real situation, we were able actually to delve into issues that we probably wouldn't really engage in so much outside of a context like that. So, yeah.
Stop there, Jesse.